everyone. Welcome to Off the Podium. My next guest is possibly one of the greatest tuba players living today in the world. So I'm honored to have Roger Bobo with me on Off the Podium. Welcome to Off the Podium, Roger.
Thank you. I don't play anymore. And maybe 50 years ago, I was one of the best tuba players in the world.
I actually wanted to go back and ask you a couple of questions about your teachers and how you got started with the tuba. I know a little bit about how you got started with tuba, but I want to know specifically who you studied tuba with and who were your mentors.
When I was in grammar school, they took a few of the talented kids that were going to graduate from grammar school to the local high school to see the band room. So I went there, and I saw back in the corner this sousaphone. Do you know what a sousaphone is?
Of course.
And I took off. I ran into it and climbed into the thing and started playing it. I already knew how to play trumpet. I had been playing since 7 years old. And so I could play everything I could play on the trumpet on the tuba immediately. And that caused a lot of attention. And then I got into a lot of trouble because we weren't supposed to touch anything. So between the attention I got and between the forbidden fruit syndrome, because it was forbidden, it became even more attractive. Then I got hooked on the tuba.
Wow.
I was 12 years old.
In college or later, who did you study with? Some of your mentors in college and post-high school that you studied with?
I went to the Eastman School of Music, and I studied there with a man called Donald Knobb. He wasn't a tubist. He was a bass trombone player in the Rochester Philharmonic. And I was very lucky when I went to the Eastman School of Music, age 18. Rochester Philharmonic had an unexpected vacancy, and they heard about me from a conductor that I by chance played for. His name was Eric Leinsdorf, and I auditioned for the Rochester Philharmonic, and I got it. So my first day as a freshman at the Eastman School of Music, I also got the Rochester Philharmonic position.
Wow.
And that's quite different than the situation is today. For example, the Los Angeles Philharmonic is opening up in a couple of months. And because of the virus, they're postponing the audition, but there's going to be over 200 applicants for that job.
Wow.
So when I went to Eastman, there was one, and now for LA, there's 200.
Wow.
It's quite a different world, as I said before.
Yeah. This next question is for the younger audiences and the younger tuba players or musicians in general. What advice would you give them? What have you done in your career that you would suggest for them to do in achieving some of the things that you have?
Well, you have to love music and you have to be motivated. And that can be complicated. You know, there's dedication, obsession, and fanaticism. So somewhere in that spectrum, you got to be sort of obsessive to become successful as an instrument player. And it's hard. Every person has to figure that out for themselves. It's a lot of hobbyists that are dedicated.
Yeah. And you did say something in one of your master classes. You said something along the lines of students need to learn to teach themselves.
Becoming your own teacher is the key to it all, and that's done through listening. You may have the best teacher in the world, but most of your music education is going to come to you by listening, and that's not only just tuba or not only just brass instruments, but singers and cellists and violinists and pianists, and jazz and rock and roll and all the genres.
I was thinking, tuba, for those who don't know, who follow this podcast and are not really musicians, tuba is a relatively new orchestral instrument. So are there any composers that you really love and wish that tuba existed back then when they were composing? And which composers would those be?
It's easy. I haven't thought too much about it, but it's absolutely easy. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven. Let's start there.
Uh-huh.
Shortly after Beethoven, the tuba became used. It's been around 125 years or something.
Yeah.
You know, Dvorak and Brahms, Wagner, of course.
If you were to pick, three or four composers that come to mind that when you saw in your long career as an orchestral musician, you saw their names on the program, you knew that there's a tuba in that particular piece that you got really excited about. What are those composers, or maybe what are those specific pieces?
You know, I'm still excited about Mahler. I still get emotional listen to Mahler symphonies. So Mahler, of course, there's Wagner, who was one of the first users of tuba. And for modern symphony orchestra, Wagner, Richard Strauss, Bartok, Mahler, Bruckner, Dvorak.
The next question is actually from a fan. He said, ask him about the recordings of Liszt's symphonic poem Hunderschlacht he made in LA with conductor Zubin Mehta, or other recordings with Mehta. I want to hear about the process, about the recordings, anything that you could remember, maybe some interesting stories from those times.
Well, we made many records together. That's 50 years ago now.
Yeah.
I mean, 50 years ago, I had already recorded with the LA Philharmonic in Zubin.
Yeah.
One of the famous recordings is a recording of the planets, where there's, I think it's in Uranus, there's this one massive low E natural for the tuba. And I had a friend whose name was Tommy Johnson, who was on another recording session during the same period where there were two tubas. And I asked if Tommy Johnson could play some of this recording with me. And he had the best low register in the world. And he played this low E natural and shook the room with the power of it. And now it's become an occult tuba thing. Everybody has to own or have heard that record. So I go around and do master classes, and people say, "How did you do that? What? How did you get that note to sound so well?" And of course, there were two of us on it, but Tommy made twice the sound. And I would tell them, "Yeah, well, you practice really hard. Make sure you take deep breaths, and you can work up to doing that."
One of the things that really was impressive for me, I've known about you for a while, but when I asked you to be on the podcast, I didn't know that you were ever appeared on the Johnny Carson Show.
Oh yeah, a
That
couple of
was
times.
a couple of times. Yeah, actually, it was surprising because I found one clip and I was like, "Wow, that's a different one." And you know what I loved about that show? Of course, the playing and your conversation with Johnny Carson, but most importantly, when you got on and he introduced you, you also introduced your pianist, which I thought was fantastic both times.
Yeah, I think it's correct. I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, that was awesome. So, how did that happen? Is there a backstory to that? How did you get on the Johnny Carson Show?
They called me. I think Doc Severinsen might have had something to do with it, but I got a call. They said they would like to have you on the show, and I thought about a millionth of a second. I said, "Sure, that sounds fine with me."
You are possibly one of the few tuba players to appear on that show, huh?
Yes, but the tuba today has developed into quite a different thing than it was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Or in the case of in the case of the Johnny Carson Show, 30 years ago or 35 years ago, it's really become a different thing. And I was the only one. I think I was about the only tuba soloist at that time. And subsequently, there's there's 5 or 6 or 7 people who make their living as a tuba soloist now.
Okay. Any names that come off the top of your head? Can you say any of the names?
Sure. Roland Senpali, he's a Hungarian. Øystein Bosvik, he's a Norwegian. Velvet Brown, she's an American. Who else? Well, you caught me by surprise. I know these names, but they're not popping into my head right now.
No worries. It's tough. A couple of things. The first question is a life changing moment for you. It could be a personal moment, personal life changing moment, or a life changing moment in in your musical career. What comes to mind is really a big moment that changed your life.
Well, there's a few of them. First of all, at age 18, winning the Rochester Philharmonic. And secondly, would be the Carnegie recital, I think in 1962. And it was the first tuba recital in New York City. And because it was the first tuba recital in New York City, the critics came. And I think I surprised them that it was a good recital. I think they came prepared to write a humorous piece in their reviews, but I played well. So that, and then a few years later, I won the job in the Concertgebouw Orchestra of Amsterdam. That was a pivotal moment. Then I won LA, came back to my hometown of LA and stayed there for 25 years. And I played in the studios while I was there, and I made several solo albums. Of course, it was LPs at the time. Now they've all been reduced and mixed up with each other. I think they were the best. It was a small record company called Crystal Records. And I think that it was the highest seller of this small company. And it still is. I still get a weekly residual check. Wow. Maybe it's $12. By this time, it's $12.50 a year. But I still get it. And then I played 25 years in LA. And I had extraordinary musical experiences with great conductors and great soloists, great colleagues. And then it came time for a sabbatical. They opened up a sabbatical program. And I asked Zubin, who was the conductor at the time I was going to take the sabbatical, what he thought, where I should go. He said, go to Italy. So I went to Italy. I went to Florence, Italy. And that was also a pivotal time in my career, because after 3 months living on a farm outside of Florence with a view of the city line from the haystack in this farm, I decided I'm not going back. I'm not going back to LA. I'm not going to drive 2 hours a day to go to work and come back. And I didn't go back.
Wow.
They changed the contract. I told them I'm not coming back. And they said, well, you have to pay the money we paid you back because you have to come back. I said, okay, by the year 2040, I'll probably be able to pay you back. A week later, they called me and said, okay, you don't have to pay us back. I never know what happened, how that happened. I was happy it happened. And subsequently, they've changed the contract for sabbaticals with a clause in the contract saying if you don't come back, you have to pay us the money. Wow. So you have to come back. And I'm very proud of this. That is called the Bobo clause. And of all my career accomplishments, I think I'm most proud of that.
Going back a little bit, why did you leave Amsterdam, and do you have any regrets? I know you're happy to go back to your hometown of LA, but any regrets at all from leaving Amsterdam?
Yes, because as soon as I got to LA, as soon as my belongings arrived, and I found a place to live. I was uncentered. I loved Europe. I was happy in Amsterdam. I mean, I was happy with the city of Amsterdam. And to go back to sort of an antiseptic Los Angeles made me uneasy. I don't know what would have happened. You know, I don't regret where I am now. I don't regret the way history presented itself to me, but I missed Europe and Amsterdam in a painful way in my 25 years in LA. And I went back to Europe almost every year, sometimes more than once a year. Sometimes I was invited to play a concerto with the orchestra or give a master class or sometimes to conduct. And I just lived to get back to Europe.
And since you mentioned conducting, what led you to that path? Having such a big, successful career as a tuba player, virtuoso tuba player, both as a soloist and also an orchestral musician, what led you to conducting?
Well, I found that playing all those years in symphony orchestra concerts, you know, probably averaging 2 or 3 or 4 concerts a week for 35 years, you know, I start to take ownership of that music. I start to develop my own thoughts how it should go. And I was fascinated by the conductors I played with. Bernard Haitink, Zubin Mehta, Carlo Maria Gillini, Eric Leinsdorf, Pierre Boulez. And this was just fascinating to me. And I thought, okay, I'm going to give it a try. And I lived in a section of Los Angeles, which was then sort of an artist community. And one of my friends said, let's start an orchestra here. We're going to call it the Topanga Philharmonic. She was very pushy, and we organized it. And it was very amateur. I just got people, friends, local people who were amateurs to come in. And through the years, I think there was 17 years of Topanga Philharmonic concerts. It grew. It became known as a fun event. We would have one rehearsal on a Sunday morning and a concert that Sunday afternoon. But I was able to attract colleagues in the Los Angeles Philharmonic and colleagues from the studios and the amateurs from Topanga. And it was, you know, it gave me experience on the podium. And it gave me the illusion that I was good. So I pursued it, and I've conducted a lot of places now.
But you also had the best seat in the house with all those orchestras. You sat there. You could watch this conductor, as you mentioned, and just, you know, even on pieces that you probably didn't play, it was you could just still be back there and watch the conductors. That's ideal.
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And I was very fascinated by the behavior of the great artists. You know, I would sort of hang around backstage watching how Vladimir Horowitz behaves, or, you know, how Pavarotti behaves before a concert. And I took great interest in that, and I learned a lot about it.
Since we live in a world now with, especially with everything going on, I don't like to talk about politics or current events, but with everything happening now, this is something that for decades and generations and centuries people will most likely talk about. What do you think that will come out of this that will be positive for the arts world, for the orchestral and for the music world in general? And what do you think that will really impact it negatively?
Well, negatively is easy. You know, there are a lot of great musicians around now who are not being paid. You know, orchestras aren't working, and bands aren't playing, bars aren't open. You know, all the musicians, freelancers, symphony musicians, and soloists, people like me, who I still travel a lot and give master classes all over the world. And I just came back from Japan, and I was then ready to go on another tour to Los Angeles, USC, and several colleges across the country to Indiana University. And then I was going to go to Italy. Then I was going to go to Slovenia, and then I was going to go to Budapest. And of course, from leaving Japan, which I left just in time, and it became clear that there was not going to be a tour. And all my friends, all my colleagues who do the same thing I do, travel around the world presenting master classes, we're all grounded. We're all grounded. So this brings out the positive part because people are collaborating. And I see, the great tubists that I know, I mentioned some of their names, I see them online playing duets with each other, or trios, or quartets. And one of them's in Europe, and the other one's in Japan, and the other one's in United States. And this is amazing. It's opening up a lot of doors. It's this musical energy that we all have has to find an outlet, and people are, through the internet, discovering these outlets. I think that's going to last. I think it's a good thing. And in general, people are coming together in a way that was different before the virus hit. I'm communicating much more frequently with friends than I did before the virus hit. So in that way, it's a good thing. I'd like to get out of my house.
So you mentioned all these different places that you go to master classes, and when I was on your website, I just had the feeling that you are based out of Japan. Are you? Where are you? Where is home?
Oaxaca, Mexico.
Wow.
Well, I lived 10 years in Japan. I was working, I went from Amsterdam to Los Angeles, from Los Angeles to Italy. And while I was in Italy, I was working in 5 different music schools. I was teaching at the Fiesole Scuola di Musica, adjacent to Florence. I was teaching at the Rotterdam Conservatorium. I was teaching at the Lausanne Conservatory. I was teaching at the Bern Conservatory. And I was teaching at the Royal Northern College of Music, all at the same time. And through that period, I was a single parent trying to take care of my daughter. And I felt like I was living on cheap air flights and trains, but I managed. I got through it because I didn't have the LA Philharmonic salary anymore. I had to make some money. So all those 5 jobs together made me money that compared to almost to the Los Angeles Philharmonic salary. And I ended up living in Lausanne, Switzerland. And I got an invitation to go to Tokyo and give a master class, which I took very quickly. I went to Tokyo for 3 weeks. They hired me again to come and stay for 3 months. Wow. Then they hired me again with an indefinite contract with which I stayed 10 years. And from Tokyo, I came back to Los Angeles and very quickly got an invitation to go play a festival in Oaxaca called Instrumento Oaxaca. And I was so taken by this beautiful small city that I started looking around for opportunities. And there was a indigenous music school outside of the city. They invited me to come and live for 2 months and teach there. The principal language at this place, in a town called Tlahuitoltepec, the language was Mije. And, to be very graphic, probably in bad taste, I went from the computerized toilets in Tokyo to outhouses in Tlahuitoltepec. It was hard. It was a hard life. I had hot water, but I was the only person in the whole complex that had hot water. The kids were all poor, and they would wash their clothes in cold water and hang it on the line, and then it would rain. They're lucky if it dried in 2 or 3 days. It was, they had a tough life, and they still have a tough life. I'm very happy to say that many of the kids that I worked with in those 2 months are now successful musicians in Mexico, including all the symphony orchestras in Mexico, which of course now are all unemployed. They're not functioning. But I just learned from one student that she won a job in the Marine band, and they're still functioning. So the military bands are, I think, the only musicians in Mexico that are still working.
You spoke a little bit about your daughter and how you were a single parent and working through all that time. For the past couple of the guests that I've had on this podcast, we've talked about a little bit about sacrificing for music, or also just trying to balance the family and the career. We know about your sacrifices. You could talk a bit more about that. But how do you balance family, your daughter, and also trying to deal with all these other things, musical career stuff?
Well, my daughter lives in a suburb of Los Angeles now, and she and her husband are making a good living, and she's 42 now. And in fact, she's going to be 42 in 2 days. I'm really glad for this opportunity. I can see the calendar. April 9th is my daughter's birthday. So I don't have a family problem. I live alone here. It was a problem then. I was restless. Let's say from the time, even when I was in Amsterdam, I was restless. When I came back to Los Angeles, I was really restless. And in that 25 years, it was a tough time for me, and a tough time for anybody who lived with me.
I've read a couple of places that you really love food, you enjoy it, and you know a lot about it, and you also love wine. So maybe a little bit about food, the types of food that you maybe miss in LA that you can't find in Mexico or other places, and also a little bit about wine and your love for that.
Well, I'm not an educated person about wine. There are many, many, many people I know who are more sophisticated in that regard than I am. But food, I living in Japan for 10 years was paradise to me. And I just came back from Japan. I've been here now. I think I've been back a little over a month after being a month in Japan. That was wonderful. I enjoyed the Japanese food. What else? I like Indonesian food, which I was able to enjoy in Amsterdam because Indonesia used to be a colony. I like Thai food because I've been going to Thailand quite a few times um, before and after I left Los Angeles. And most Asian food I like. Vietnamese food. I'm supposed to go to Taiwan in August. I'm hoping that it will work. I'm planning on it not working. But I love to travel. I miss Indian food. I'd love to have some Indian food.
Someone who came before you, someone who is another tuba legend, is Arnold Jacobs. Your time with him, maybe some stories about him that you remember that you are willing to share with us.
It's very boastful story. He's a wonderful teacher, extraordinary teacher. He's a great musician, and he's also probably has the equivalent of a doctor's degree, particularly regarding pulmonary function. And he knows how the body operates. And I was 18 years old on my way home from Interlaken National Music Camp to Los Angeles. And I had to change trains in Chicago. And I called him up. I went to his house and I played for him. And he told me he didn't have anything to teach me. He said, "You're doing everything right. I don't have anything to teach you." And I hardly remember that. People had heard that story, and it comes back to me sometimes. Suddenly, just 1 year ago, somebody who was at a master class where Jacobs told that story had taped it. So you can find it online. Jacobs saying, "I didn't know what to say to him. He played everything okay."
That's
So
awesome.
that was a good, it was a good story. Subsequently, since he turned me down from teaching, I've had dozens of telephone conversations with him, me from Los Angeles, he in Chicago, and I've learned enormous amounts of information that, of course, helps me in my teaching. I've become a passionate teacher. I enjoy teaching even more than playing in a symphony orchestra, which I really, really enjoyed.
Your fans and people in general who know about orchestral music know some things about you. Now, I want you to think about something that they don't know and share with us, if you don't mind. Something about Roger Bobo that not many people know that you're willing to tell us.
Oh, I'm a closet writer. I've written several short stories and I've written hundreds of blogs. I wish, I haven't been motivated for the last year to write, but this time sequestered in my home, I think probably I have to start writing again.
Repertoire for tuba. I know early on in your career, if I'm not mistaken, you've said something that the tuba repertoire wasn't as much or as big, but now many composers, I'm sure, compose for tuba. If you were to pick about 3 to 5 pieces that come to mind that are just important pieces for solo tuba or tuba concerto, what would they be?
Oh, well, of course, the Vaughan Williams concerto was the first thing. As a matter of fact, I just got through teaching a lesson to a guy in Israel about the Vaughan Williams concerto. And Hindemith wrote a sonata. And subsequently, there's literally hundreds of pieces for tuba solo.
Mhm.
When I was a boy, there was nothing. There was nothing. Solo pomposo, something for tuba and band that came out of the 50s. Roger Kellaway, the great jazz pianist, wrote several things for tuba that were wonderful. Bill Kraft, who was a famous modern composer,
Yeah.
he wrote a piece called Encounters 2, which became famous piece. And the repertoire now is so big. By the time I retired from playing the tuba, I had maybe 10 pieces that I could play. Now there are hundreds, and everybody has their own pieces. The man I mentioned, Roland Sinpali, the great tuba player, 50 years from now, he's going to be known as a composer at the same level as we think of Stravinsky and Bartok. He's that good. It's extraordinary.
And you mentioned Stravinsky, and any stories with Stravinsky? From what I understand, you've also worked with him for a little bit in LA while he was in LA and you were in LA.
Yes, I worked with him quite a bit. One time I was playing a recording session. We were playing Stravinsky's works. And he was sitting, I was warming up in the back row of the setup of the orchestra. And he and the producer of the record company was sitting right behind me. And he was being uh, interviewed by this producer. And he was telling this story about a young boy in Russia. This is Stravinsky talking. He was very young and naive, but he he was pretty talented. He was a student of Rimsky-Korsakov. He was influenced by Korsakov. He was influenced by Tchaikovsky. And while I was sitting with my head cocked sideways so I could hear this conversation, it was fantastic to hear Stravinsky talking about this boy. I think he said he was 16 years old. And as I was listening to this interview, there was music being passed out. And they put this music on my stand. And as I was listening, I opened it up. And right away, it was old. The paper was brown. The font looked like the font and engraving of a Tchaikovsky symphony that we still see today. And except that, they've all been, the brown has been taken out. It's fresh, but it's still that Russian font. Sometimes even Cyrillic letters. And this piece was passed out, Symphony Number 1. I said, man, this looks like Tchaikovsky. What is it? It was the piece that Stravinsky wrote when he was 16 years old.
Wow.
It was just Stravinsky Number 1. And it did sound like Tchaikovsky. And it was a very talented young man's work.
That's impressive. One of the last things I'll ask you before I let you go, I've already taken up a lot of your time, but you said something in another interview that, or I think maybe it was a masterclass, you said we get too analytical about breathing, about just thinking about music, and I feel very similar to that. What are your thoughts? What did you really mean by that? And if you could say a few words about thinking too much in music.
It's funny you mentioned it because I listen to students on video all the time. They send me videos and I make comments. It's another one of my therapies for coping with being incarcerated in my house. And this young boy was breathing absolutely perfect. And I said, please beware of anybody who ever comes to you and says they're going to teach you how to breathe. You're doing it just right. Because it was natural and it was functional. You put all the brass players, brass teachers in the world together in one room, and let's say there's 200 guys there, 200 people, guys and women. Each one is going to have a different idea about breathing. My idea is to make it as least complicated as possible. So I have this book. It just happens to be on my desk.
Yeah.
And, it's just very natural exercises that people can do to both develop good function, breathing, and other things, and maintain it. So it's good for a seasoned symphony orchestra player as it is for a beginner. Breathing, we hope, is simple. People try to make it complicated by hyperanalyzation, and it really screws them up.
Yeah. And can you say the title of that book, because most of our listeners are not going to see the video? So what's the title? And of course, it's by you.
It's called Mastering the Tuba, a catchy name. Mastering the Tuba, and it's an Editions Beam edition. It's a publisher in Switzerland.
Well, thank you so much. Anything that we missed that you wanted to talk about before we head out?
No, it's been a pleasure. I have to tell you something. It's a little embarrassing. This is my second interview for a podcast today.
Wow, that's awesome. It's great. So this gives you some space to actually get some interviews done, because you're usually busy teaching, so you probably don't have time for these.
I'm sequestered in my home. I have time for these.
Yeah.
I hope I have 2 more tomorrow.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can do this another time, and maybe even live in person.
Come down to Oaxaca. It's a good place. We only have 22 cases of the coronavirus at this point in time.
Yeah.
Let's hope it stays the same.
Thanks so much for joining me.
All right, my pleasure. Hope we meet again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.